Hey everybody, my name is Tim Stratton. I'm with Freethinking Ministries, and tonight I'm on the campus of the University of Nebraska at Omaha, the big city of Omaha, Nebraska. I live in Kearney, Nebraska, which is 2.5 hours away or so it's always good to get to the metropolis of Nebraska and Omaha. At Freethinking Ministries, our goal is to equip the church to engage the culture. And we do this by teaching people what they should believe. I like to call that theology. And why they should believe it. I call that apologetics. So we're focused on teaching people what they should believe and why they should believe it. And, we desire all people to think correctly about ultimate reality. We desire all people to think correctly about God. And this means that we love to grapple with the big questions. We're not afraid of these big questions. In fact, we invite them. We want to see them. We want to hear from you. We want to know what questions are on your mind, and we want to interact with them. We love to grapple with the big questions. What might come as a surprise to many today is that Christ followers actually have a rich history of grappling with these big questions. One question in particular has consumed the minds of Christians for centuries. It usually goes something like this. If God is in control over all things, well, how are humans really free and responsible for anything? And if humans are really free and responsible for some things, then how is God in control over all things? Well, over the past 500 years, it seems that those within the walls of the church have been really given only two answers from which to choose. You've probably heard of them. You either have Calvinism on one hand or Arminianism on the other. There's your two options, church. Pick one of them, fight about those two. And people have thought over those two options. Be that as it may, neither option satisfies many of those who take theology, let alone their entire Bible, seriously. This is the case because Calvinism, although it seems to make sense of so much Scripture, doesn't make sense of all Scripture. And Arminianism, although it makes sense of much Scripture, it doesn't seem to make sense of all Scripture. Now, Calvinism seems to be reducible to divine determinism, a view that God exhaustively causes and determines, in one way or another, all things that happen. Now, if all things really means all things, then this would include all the thoughts, actions, beliefs, and behaviors of all people all the time. Well, this leads many to conclude that if Calvinism is true, then God is ultimately the author of evil and the one who forces the majority of humanity to suffer in the eternal fires of hell for all eternity. This does not seem like the omnibenevolent God who is love, according to 1 John 4:8, that Jesus claimed to represent, or the God who desires all people to be saved, according to 1 Timothy 2:4, and the God who desires no one to perish, according to 2 Peter 3:9, or the God who so loved the world that whosoever, John 3:16. Because of these scriptures, and perhaps some common sense, this leads many to choose the second option, Arminianism, also known as the simple foreknowledge view. Now, this view gives humans the freedom to choose our individual eternal destinies. And it gets God off the hook for the evil deeds that humans freely choose to commit. Well, that's the good news. But the bad news is that this simple foreknowledge view also seems to relieve God of his providence and sovereignty. After all, if God simply foreknows the future free actions of creatures or foresees them, how is he in any legitimate control of the future free actions of creatures. Moreover, the Bible is clear that God is not only sovereign, but that he predestines not only the elect to heaven, according to Galatians 1:15, but also that God is provident over all things, according to Romans 8:28. Well, if God predestines all things to happen, then how could this simple foreknowledge view of Arminianism be true? This dilemma, however, is a false dichotomy. Contrary to popular opinion and teachings within the church, there is another option from which to choose, an option in the middle between Calvinism and Arminianism. It seems the answer to the original question is best answered by a 16th century theologian from Spain named Luis de Molina. Molinism, derived from his last name, grounds God's sovereignty not only in his omnipotence, as divine determinists seem to solely focus, but also Molina considered God's omniscience. Namely, Molina pointed out that since God is all-powerful, omnipotent, then God has the ability to create many different, what we refer to as possible worlds. God had the ability to create many different possible worlds or different situations or scenarios because he's all-powerful. He could do these things, including worlds with creatures who he... Facebook world. All right. So, God is omnipotent. However, if God was powerful enough to create different worlds, since he is also all-knowing and omniscient, God would perfectly know all that would happen in each of these potential worlds that are within God's power to create, if God chose to create them. This is even the case if God never brought these worlds into existence. God still knows what would have happened if he created any of these worlds within his power to bring into actual existence. This full view of God's omniscience includes what is referred to as middle knowledge. Dr. Kirk McGregor provides a proper definition of middle knowledge in his biography of Luis de Molina. He says, middle knowledge is God's knowledge of all things that would happen in every possible set of circumstances, both things that are determined to occur by those circumstances and things that are not determined to occur by those circumstances. That's how McGregor defines middle knowledge. I think it's a good definition. But why is this kind of knowledge referred to as middle? What is this kind of knowledge in the middle of? Middle knowledge is between, that's why it's called in the middle, or why it's called middle. Middle knowledge is in between God's natural knowledge and his free knowledge. Now, most Christians have never heard of these terms before. How many of you have heard of God's natural knowledge and his free knowledge? Anybody? Scott doesn't count. Okay, I just got a couple of you, right? But the vast majority of you have never heard of these terms. Well, I'll explain it. God's natural knowledge simply refers to everything he knows that he could actualize or has the power to create. All potential situations within his power to make actual. God knows what he can do, even if he never does it. That's a good nutshell summary of it. God knows what he's got the power to do. Middle knowledge refers to the fact that God knows everything that would happen if he were to create a certain world or situation within his power to make actual. Even if he never does it, he still knows what would happen if he did it, right? Okay? So God knows what he's got the power to do, and he knows what would happen if he used his power to do it. And God's free knowledge means that God knows all that will happen in the world he has actually chosen to create. That is to say, that if God is always omniscient, then God perfectly knows all that could happen and all that will happen. And he also knows all that would have happened in the different situations he could have created. That is to say, God knows all that could, would, and will happen. Middle knowledge brings the would. Now, this gets a bit technical. Don't hold that against me. This won't last long. But it's vital to note that God's knowledge of what could and would happen is logically before God's decree to create the world or create the universe. God's knowledge of what will happen, you could call that foreknowledge, in the universe is logically after, not chronologically after, his creative decree. Okay, enough of that technical stuff. This is an intro level talk. But let's get to the main point. How does Molina's work regarding middle knowledge solve the perplexing riddle that we previously considered? Let's examine it once more. If God is in control over all things, how are humans really free and responsible for anything? And if humans are really free and responsible for some things, then how is God in control over all things? That's a great question. And Luis de Molina can answer it. You see, if God has the power and ability to create free creatures whom he does not causally determine, that's not to say he can't influence you, but influence and causal determinism are two different things. Okay, but if God has the power and ability to create free creatures whom he does not causally determine, and he perfectly knows how these free creatures would freely think, act, believe, and behave if he were to create them, then if God chooses to create them, knowing how they would freely think, act, believe, and behave, then God can actualize a world where these creatures will freely think, act, believe, and behave exactly as God knew they would. Mind blown much? I mean, yeah, this is mind-blowing, isn't it? But it's really cool, and I think it paints a beautiful picture of God and shows his sovereignty. Well, if that's genuinely the case, then it follows that God is not causally determining free creatures, because they're genuinely free creatures. There's no causal strings or chains attached. These creatures, humans, are not always causally determined and seem to have a genuine ability to choose otherwise, at least to think otherwise, at least occasionally. And it seems to me that the Bible really affirms this as well. The middle knowledge Molinism offers is a great middle position between Calvinism and Arminianism. This is because, like Calvinism, Molinism affirms the biblical truth that God predestines all things that will happen, and that there is nothing outside of God's sovereignty in all of his creation. However, like Arminianism, Molinism also affirms and logically explains how humans possess a genuine libertarian free will, and that humans are genuinely responsible for our moral thoughts and actions, at least occasionally, among other things. Although Calvinism and Arminianism can both make sense of much biblical data, as I said earlier, neither of them seem to explain all the data. After considering God's middle knowledge, however, Molinism seems to be able to explain biblical data from cover to cover. I encourage people to read an article I wrote on freethinkingministries.com simply called Molinism is Biblical. And I make a case for Molinism, not going into any kind of philosophical arguments or anything like that that's simply focused on Bible verses in the Old and New Testament. I encourage you to see that. Molinism is biblical. Not only does Molinism make sense of a full view of the biblical data, it is also a logically coherent view that never violates God's essential omni-attributes. I've written a lot on the website also, on the Freethinking Ministries website, based on an argument I crafted known as the omni-argument. So that is to say that affirming Molina's view of God's sovereignty does not scathe God's omnipotence, nor does it scathe God's omniscience, and nor does it violate God's omnibenevolence. Calvinism and the simple foreknowledge view, let alone other views not mentioned in tonight's presentation, cannot make the same claim. Moreover, on top of that, Molinism destroys, as the Apostle Paul says in 2 Corinthians 10:5, the greatest objection raised against the knowledge of God, the problem of evil. Why would God allow suffering and evil and pain? Why would a perfectly good, powerful, and omniscient God allow pain and evil and suffering in the world? Guess what? Molinism can answer that objection, that question, forcefully. I recommend another article I've written called Lex Luthor's Lousy Logic. And Molinism seems to make sense of a plethora of other apologetic-based arguments for God's existence. I recommend another essay I've written called The Apologetic Significance of Molinism, in which I show that most of the arguments in the cumulative case for the existence of God are either illuminated by Molinism, or these arguments seem to assume some essential key ingredients that only Molinism has access to. So I encourage you to read that article as well, The Apologetic Significance of Molinism. That is to say, that middle knowledge and Molinism provide the best explanation of all the data. Well, thank you for listening to this intro level talk about Molinism. I'm asked quite often if, because I'm talking about all these deep things all the time on the website about Molinism and middle knowledge, and people are saying, hey, I've only usually heard of Calvinism and Arminianism, and neither seems right to me. Well, like I said, Molinism, the ideas of Luis de Molina, the Spanish theologian from the 16th century, I think his ideas offer, he splits the horns of that false dichotomy. I think Molina is onto something. And I think if we all take the time to really understand it, he builds a bridge that we can all meet on, no matter what camp you're currently in between the two competing views of Arminianism and Calvinism. There's other views out there too, but definitely Arminianism and Calvinism are what people are most aware of, and I hope you guys will consider Molinism. So thank you for listening, and bye everybody in Facebook world.